The Shadow of Death. An entire year after the eruption of Krakatoa in the East Indies in 1883, sunset and sunrise in both hemispheres were very colorful. Lava dust suspended in the air and carried around the globe accounted for this phenomenon. In 1783, after the eruption of Skaptar-Jökull in Iceland, the world was darkened for months. Records of this phenomenon are known in many contemporary authors. One German contemporary compared the gloomy world of the year 1783 with the Egyptian plague of darkness. The world was gloomy in the year of Caesar's death, 44 BC. After the murder of Caesar, the dictator, and during the Antonine War, there was almost a whole year's continuous gloom, wrote Pliny. Virgil described this year in these words: "The sun veiled his shining face in dusky gloom, and the godless age feared everlasting night. Germany heard the clash of arms through all the sky. The Alps rocked with unwonted terrors, and specters, pale in wondrous wise, were seen at evening twilight." On September 23rd, 44 BC, a short while after the death of Caesar, on the very day when Octavian performed the rites in honor of the deceased, a comet became visible at daytime. It was very bright and moved from north to west. It was seen for only a few days and vanished while still in the north. It appears that the gloom which enveloped the world the year after Caesar's death was caused by the dust of the comet dispersed in the atmosphere. The clash of arms heard through all the sky was probably the sound that accompanied the entrance of the gases and dust into the Earth's atmosphere. If the eruption of a single volcano can darken the atmosphere over the entire globe, a simultaneous and prolonged eruption of thousands of volcanoes would blacken the sky. And if the dust of the comet of 44 BC had a darkening effect, contact of the Earth with a great cinder-trailing comet of the 15th century before this era could likewise cause the blackening of the sky. As this comet activated all of the volcanoes and it created new ones, the cumulative action of the eruptions and of the comet's dust must have saturated the atmosphere with floating particles. Volcanoes vomit water vapor as well as cinders. The heating effect of the contact of the globe with the comet must have caused a great evaporation from the surface of the seas and rivers. Two kinds of clouds, water, vapor, and dust, were formed. The clouds obscured the sky, and drifting very low hung as fog. The veil left by the gaseous trail of hostile star and the smoke of the volcanoes caused darkness, not complete but profound, advanced darkness. This condition prevailed for decades, and only very gradually did the dust subside and the water vapors condense. A vast night reigned over all the American land, of which tradition speaks unanimously. In a sense, the sun no longer existed for this ruined world, which was lightened up at intervals only by frightful conflagrations, revealing the full horror of their situation to the small number of human beings that had escaped from these calamities. Following the cataclysm caused by the waters, the author of the Codex Immanuel, in his history of the suns, shows us terrifying celestial phenomenon, twice followed by the darkness that covered the face of the earth. In one instance, for a period of 25 years, this fact is mentioned in the Codex Immanuel and in most of the traditions of Mexico. Gamarra, the Spaniard who came to the Western Hemisphere in the middle of the 16th century, shortly after the conquest, wrote, "After the destruction of the fourth sun, the world plunged into darkness. During the space of 25 years, amid this profound obscurity, 10 years before the appearance of the fifth sun, mankind was regenerated." How? In the years of this gloom, when the world was covered with clouds and shrouded in mist, the Quiche tribe migrated to Mexico, crossing a sea enveloped in somber fog. In the so-called manuscript Quiche, it is also narrated that there was little light on the surface of the earth. The faces of the sun and of the moon were covered in clouds. In the Ipuwer Papyrus in Leningrad, previously mentioned, there are lamentations about a terrible catastrophe when heaven and earth turned upside down. I show thee the land upside down. It happened that which never had happened. After this catastrophe, when darkness covered the earth, the sun is veiled and shines, not in the sight of men. None can live when the sun is veiled by clouds. None knoweth that midday is there. The shadow is not discerned. Not dazzling is the sight when he, the sun, is beheld. He is in the sky like the moon. In this description, the light of the sun is compared to the light of the moon. But even in the light of the moon, objects cast a shadow. If the midday could not be discerned, the disk of the sun was not clearly visible, and only its diffused light made the day different from the night.
The gloom gradually lifted in the passing years,
as the clouds became less thick.
Little by little, the sky and the sun appeared less and less veiled. The years of darkness in Egypt are described in a number of other documents. The Papyrus Ipuwer, which contains the story of the plagues of Egypt, says that the land is without light, dark. In the Papyrus Anastasia IV, the years of misery are described, and it is said, the sun, it hath come to pass that it riseth not. It was the time of the wandering in the desert. Is there any indication that the desert was dark? Jeremiah 2:6, neither said, where is the Lord that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, that led us through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and of pits, through a land of drought and of the shadow of death, through a land that no man passed through, and where no man dwelt. The shadow of death is related to the time of the wanderings in the desert after the exodus from Egypt. The sinister meaning of the word shadow of death corresponds with the description of the Hermitage Papyrus. None can live when the sun is veiled by clouds. At intervals, the earth was lighted by conflagrations in the desert. The phenomenon of gloom, enduring for years, impressed itself on the memory of the 12 tribes, and is mentioned in many passages of the Bible. Thou hadst covered us with the shadow of death. Psalms 44:19. The people that walked in darkness in the land of the shadow of death. Isaiah 9:2. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness in a solitary way, hungry and thirsty. Their soul fainted in them. And the Lord brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death. Psalms 107. The terrors of the shadow of death. Job 24:17. In Job 38, the Lord speaks, who shut up the sea with doors, barriers, when it brake forth. I think Velikovsky says the entire Old Testament is basically just from one end to the other. Catastrophes. It's more like history. And I also heard a rumor that it was the history of Atlantis, the destruction of Atlantis, but I don't know if that's true or not. When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness, a swaddling hand for it, and caused the dayspring to know his place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it. The low and slowly drifting clouds enshrouded the wanderers in the desert. These clouds dimly glowed at night. In their upper portion reflected the sunlight, the glow being pale during the day and red after sunset. The Israelites were able to distinguish between day and night. They were protected by the clouds from the sun during the wandering in the desert. Midrashic literature, they saw sun and moon for the first time only at the end of the wandering. The clouds that covered the desert during the wandering of the 12 tribes were called a celestial garment, or clouds of glory. He spread a cloud for a covering, and fire to give it light in the night. And the cloud of the Lord was upon them by day. For days or months the cloud tarried in one place, and the Israelites journeyed not. But when the cloud moved, the wanderers followed it and revered it because of its celestial origin. In Arabic sources, too, we read that the Amalekites, who left Hejaz because of plagues, followed the cloud in their wandering through the desert. On their way to Palestine and Egypt, they met the Israelites, and in the battles between them, the screen of clouds played an important part. Nihonji, a chronicle of Japan from the earliest period, refers to a time when there was continuous darkness, and no difference of day and night. It describes in the name of the Emperor Kami Yamamoto an ancient time when the world was given over to widespread desolation. It was an age of darkness and disorder, and this gloom, Hikaho Nanahangi no Mikoto, fostered justice, and so governed this western border. In China, the annals telling of the time of the Emperor Yahoo refer to the Valley of Obscurity and to the somber residence as places of astronomical observations. The name Shadow of Death expresses the influence of the sunless gloom upon the life processes. The Chinese annals of Wang Xixing, in the chapter dealing with 10 stems, the 10 stages of the Earth's primal history, relate that at Wu, the 6th stem, darkness destroys the growth of all things. Buddhist scholars declare that with the beginning of the 6th world age, or sun, the whole world becomes filled with smoke and saturated with greasiness of the smoke. There is no distinction of day and night. The gloom is caused by a cycle-destroying great cloud of cosmic origin and dimensions. On the Samoan Islands, the Aborigines narrate, "Then arose smell. The smell became smoke, which again became clouds. The sea too arose, and in a stupendous catastrophe of nature, the land sank into the sea. The new earth, the Samoan Islands, arose out of the womb of the last earth. In the darkness that enveloped the world, the islands of Tonga, Samoa, Rotuma, Fiji, and Uvea, Wallis Island, and Futuna rose from the bottom of the ocean. Ancient rhymes of the inhabitants of Hawaii refer to a prolonged darkness. The earth is dancing. Let darkness cease. The heavens are enclosing." The Quiche tribe migrated to Mexico. The Israelites were roaming in the desert. The Amalekites migrated toward Palestine and Egypt. An uneasy movement took place in all corners of the ruined world. The migration in central Polynesia, shrouded in gloom, is narrated in the traditions of the Aborigines of this part of the world about a chief named Tueru, who lived long in utter darkness in Aviki, who migrated in a canoe named Weary of Darkness to find a land of light, and who, after many years of wandering, saw the sky clearing little by little and arrived at a region where they could see each other clearly. In the Kalevala, the Finnish epos, which dates back to an enormous antiquity, the time when the sun and moon disappeared from the sky and dreaded shadows covered it, is described in these words: "Even birds grew sick and perished. Men and maidens faint and famished, perished in the cold darkness from the absence of the sunshine, from the absence of the moonlight. But the wise men of the Northland could not know the dawn of morning. For the moon shines not in season, nor appears the sun at midday from their stations in the sky vault. An explanation that would rationalize this picture as the description of a seasonal long night in northern regions. We'll stumble over the second part of the passage. The seasons did not return in their wonted order, and a dreaded shadow covered the earth when Ukko, the highest of the Finnish deities, relinquished the support of the heavens. Hailstones of iron rained down furiously, and then the world became shrouded in a generation-long darkness. This twilight of the gods of the Nordic races is but the shadow of death of the scriptures. The entire generation of those who left Egypt perished in the lightless desert. Vegetation died in the catastrophe. The Iranian book of Bundahis says blight was diffused over the vegetation, and it withered away immediately when the sky was shattered. The day became dark, and the earth teemed with noxious creatures. For a long time there was no green thing seen. Seeds would not germinate in a sunless world. It took many years before the earth again brought forth vegetation. This is told in the written and oral traditions of many peoples according to the American sources. The regeneration of the world and of humankind took place under the veil of the gloomy shadows, and the time is indicated as the end of the 15th year of darkness, 10 years before the end of the gloom. In the scriptural narration, it was probably the day when Aaron's dried twig budded for the first time. The eerie world, dark and groaning, was unpleasant to all of the senses save the sense of smell. The world was fragrant when the breeze blew. The clouds conveyed a sweet odor. In the Papyrus Anastasia 4, written in the year of misery, in which it is said the months are reversed, the planet god is described as arriving with the sweet wind before him. In a similar text by the Hebrews, we read that the times and seasons were confused, and a fragrance perfumed all the world. The perfume was brought by the pillar of smoke. The fragrance was that of myrrh and frankincense. Israel was surrounded by clouds, and as soon as the clouds were set into motion, the winds breathed myrrh and frankincense. The Vedas contain hymns to Agni, which glows from the sky. Its fragrance became the fragrance of the earth, that fragrance of thine, which the immortals of yore gathered up. The tradition of those days, when the star conveyed its fragrance to men on the earth, is immortalized in the tradition of the Hindus. The Vedic hymn compares the fragrance of the star Agni to the scent of the lotus. End of subchapter. Ambrosia. In what way did this evil of gloom dissolve itself? When the air is overcharged with vapor, dew, rain, hail, or snowfalls, most probably the atmosphere discharged its compounds, presumably of carbon and hydrogen. In a similar way, has any testimony been preserved that during the many years of gloom carbohydrates precipitated? When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell upon it. It was like the hoarfrost on the ground. It had the shape of coriander seed, the yellowish color of bdellium, and an oily taste like honeycomb. It was called corn of heaven, and it was ground between stones and baked in pans. The manna fell from the cloud. After the nightly cooling of the carbohydrates precipitated and fell with the morning dew. And morning dew still falls, especially in August. The grains dissolved in the heat and evaporated, but in a closed vessel the substance would be preserved for a long time. The exegetes have endeavored to explain the phenomenon of manna and were helped by the naturalists who discovered that a tamarisk in the desert of Sinai sheds its seeds during certain months of the year. But why should this seed be called corn of heaven, bread of heaven? Or why should it be said, it will rain bread from heaven? It is also not easy to explain how a multitude of men and animals could have existed for many years in a wilderness on the scarce and seasonal seeds of some desert plant, were such a thing possible. The desert would be preferable to tillable land that yields bread to the laborer only in the sweat of his brow. The clouds brought the heavenly bread. It is also said in the Talmud, but if the manna fell from clouds that enveloped the entire world, it must have fallen not only in the desert of wanderings, but everywhere. And not only the Israelites, but other peoples too, must have tasted it and spoken of it in their traditions. There was a world fire, says the Icelandic tradition, followed by the Thimble winter, and only one human pair remained alive in the north. This human pair lie hidden in the hole during the fire of Surt. Then came the terrible Thimble winter, at the end of the world age. Meanwhile, they feed on morning dew, and from them come the folk who people the renewed earth. Three elements are connected in the Icelandic tradition, which are the same three we met in the Israelite tradition: the world fire, the dark winter that endured many years, and the morning dew that served as food during these years of gloom. Then nothing budded. The Maori tribe of New Zealand tell of fiery winds and fierce clouds that lashed the waters into tidal waves that touched the sky and were accompanied by furious hailstorms. The ocean fled. The progeny of the storm and hail were mist and heavy dew and light dew after the catastrophe, but little of the dry land was left standing above the sea. Then clear light increased in the world, and the beings who had been hidden between sky and earth before they were parted now multiplied upon the earth. This tradition of the Maoris has substantially the same elements as the Israelite tradition. The destruction of the world was accompanied by hurricanes, hail, meteorites, and sky-high billows. The land submerged. A mist covered the earth for a long time. Heavy dew fell to the ground, together with light dew, as in the passage quoted from Numbers 11:9. The writings of Buddhism relate that when the world cycle comes to an end, with the world destroyed and the ocean dried up, there is no distinction of day and night, and heavenly ambrosia serves as food. In the hymns of Rig Veda, it is said that honey, madhu, comes from the clouds. These clouds originated from the pillar of cloud. Among the hymns of the Ardharva Veda, there is one to the honey lash. From heaven, from earth, from the atmosphere, from the sea, from the fire, and from the wind, the honey lash hath verily sprung. This clothed in amrite, ambrosia, all the creatures revering a claim in their hearts. The Egyptian Book of the Dead speaks of the divine clouds and the great dew that bring the earth into contact with the heavens. The Greeks called the heavenly bread ambrosia. It is described by the Greek poets in identical terms with manna. It had the taste of honey and a fragrance. This heavenly bread has given classical scholars many headaches. Greek authors from Homer and Hesiod down through the ages continually referred to ambrosia as the heavenly food, which in its fluid state is called nectar. But it was used also as ointment. It had the fragrance of a lily, and as food for the horses of Hera when she visited Zeus in the sky. Hera, Earth, was veiled in it when she hurried from her brother Ares, Mars, to Zeus, Jupiter. What could it be, this heavenly bread, which served also as a veil for a goddess planet, and was used as an ointment too? It was honey, said some scholars, but honey is a regular food for mortals, whereas ambrosia was given only to the generation of heroes. Then what was this substance that served as fodder on the ground for horses, as a veil for planets, bread from the sky for heroes, also turned fluid for their drink, and was oil and perfume for ointments? It was the manna that was baked into bread, had an oily taste, and also a honey taste, was found on the ground by man and beast, wrap the earth and the heavenly bodies in a veil, was called corn of heaven, and the bread of the mighty, had a fragrant odor, and served the women in the wilderness as ointment. Manna, like ambrosia, was compared with honey and with morning dew. The belief of Aristotle and the other writers that honey falls from the atmosphere with the dew was based on the experience of those days, when the world was veiled in carbon clouds that precipitated honey frost. These clouds are described as dreaded shades in the Calavella. From these dreaded shades, says the Epos, honey dropped, and the clouds, their fragrant, sifted honey from their home within the heavens. The Maoris of the Pacific, the Jews on the border of Asia and Africa, the Hindus, the Finns, the Icelanders, all describe the honey food being dropped from the clouds. Dreary shades of the shadow of death, that the source of the heavenly bread falling from the clouds with the morning dew was a celestial body. The Sibyl says that the sweet heavenly bread came from the starry heavens, the planet god Ukko, or Jupiter. It is said to have been the source of the honey that dropped from the clouds. Athena covered other planet goddesses with a robe of ambrosial and provided nectar and ambrosia to the heroes. Other traditions, too, see the origin of the honey-dew in a celestial body that enveloped the earth in clouds. For this reason, ambrosia, or manna, is called heavenly bread. End of subchapter. Rivers of milk and honey. The honey frost fell in enormous quantities. The Haggadic literature says that the quantity which fell every day would have sufficed to nourish people for 2,000 years. All the peoples of the east and west could see it. A few hours after the break of day, the heat under the cloud cover liquefied the grains and volatilized them. The ground absorbed some of the liquefied mass as it absorbs dew. The grains also fell upon the earth, and the rivers became milky in appearance. The Egyptians relate that the Nile flowed for a time blended with honey. The strange appearance of the rivers of Palestine in the desert if the Israelites saw no river caused the scouts to return from the survey of the land to call it the land that floweth with milk and honey. Numbers 13:27. The heavens rain oil, the wadis run with honey, says a text found in Ras Shamara, Ugarit in Syria. In the rabbinical literature, it is said that melting from manna formed streams that furnished drink to many deer and other animals. The Ultra Veda hymns say that honey lash came down from fire and wind. End of subchapter. That was a quick one. Jericho. The earth's crust trembled and cracked again and again as its strata settled after a major displacement. Chasms opened up, springs disappeared, and new springs appeared. When the Israelites approached the river Jordan, a slice of one bank fell, blocking the stream long enough for the tribes to cross over. The waters which came down from above stood and rose up upon a heap very far from the city, Adam, that is, beside Zaratan. And those that came down toward the sea of the plain, even the salt sea, failed and were cut off, and the people passed over right against Jericho. A similar occurrence took place on the 8th of December, 1267, when the Jordan was dammed for 16 hours, and again following the earthquake of 1927, when a slice of one bank fell into the river not far from Adam and blocked the water for over 21 hours. At Demia, Adam, the people crossed the river on its dry bed. The fall of the walls of Jericho at the blast of the trumpets is a well-known episode, but it is not well interpreted. The horns blow by the priests for 7 days played no greater natural role than Moses' rod, with which, in the legend, he opened a passage in the sea. When the people heard the sound of the trumpet, it happened that the wall fell down flat. The great sound of the trumpet was produced by the earth. The Israelite tribes, believing in magic, thought that the sound of the earth came in response to the blowing of the ram's horns for 7 days. The great walls of Jericho, they were 12 feet wide, have been excavated. They were found to have been destroyed by an earthquake. The archaeological evidences also prove that these walls collapsed at the beginning of the Hyksos period, or shortly after the close of the Middle Kingdom. The earth had not yet recovered from the previous world catastrophe and reacted with continuous tremors. When the hour of a new cosmic disaster approached, the event we described at the beginning of this book, only to go back to the cataclysm of the Exodus, the upheaval of the days of Joshua, when the earth stood still on the day of the battle at Beth Horon. End of chapter. And chapter 7 is next, called Stone Suspended in the Air. And there's a subchapter in that chapter 7 titled Atlantis. So I'm going to be interested to see what that's about. That will be coming. Thank you for listening.
Gosh, man.